Under the glare of studio lights and the rhythm of a well-oiled production, the audience clapped on cue, their faces lit with anticipation. This wasn't just another late-night taping, it was a spectacle. A place where egos clashed and sarcasm was currency. Every camera was positioned to catch smirks and stumbles. Every beat rehearsed to maximize drama. And tonight they were ready for something special. Something they expected to be fun. The host, known for her sharp tongue and surgical interviews, stepped onto the stage with her usual mix of charm and bite. She greeted the audience with confidence, her voice smooth with familiarity. "All right. All right," she said, waving a hand as the clapping swelled. "Let's bring him out. You know him. You grew up watching him slam giants and rip shirts. He's the face of an era, a legend in the ring and apparently a man of faith." There was a pause, followed by a grin. "Let's find out just how deep that faith goes." The crowd laughed. The host raised her eyebrows with mock innocence. Then came the music, familiar, thunderous, and out walked Hulk Hogan. He didn't strut. He didn't play to the crowd like he once might have. He simply walked forward, strong but measured, nodding toward the audience with a calm smile. His frame, still imposing, filled the space, but his presence wasn't loud. It was steady. He wore a black bandana, a simple button-down over his iconic frame, jeans and boots. Around his neck hung a cross on a leather cord. Not shiny, not flashy, just there. He took his seat across from the host. The cheers quieted. The cameras zoomed in. "So," the host said, leaning in slightly, "the man who told an entire generation to say their prayers and take their vitamins is here. Welcome." "Thanks for having me, brother," Hogan said, his voice gravelly but soft-spoken. "Still calling everyone brother, huh?" He chuckled lightly. "It's a habit." "I like it. Has a warmth to it." She smirked. "But tell me something. Do you ever get tired of people looking at you like you're still in a ring somewhere? Or do you still wake up every morning ready to leg drop someone who disagrees with you?" Hogan smiled, patient. "I think I'd traded in the leg drop for a little more listening these days." The audience laughed. The host tilted her head slightly. "Interesting. That's quite a change for someone who used to body slam people for a living." "Lot changes when life humbles you." She leaned back, eyeing him with interest. "Yeah, about that. Life hasn't exactly been gentle with you, has it?" He didn't answer right away, just gave a small nod. "You've lost a lot, faced a lot. Public scandals, lawsuits, personal heartbreak. How do you keep your faith through all that? Or is that more of a thing you say to keep fans inspired?" Hogan took a slow breath, then exhaled. "It's not a thing I say. It's something I hold on to." The host smiled tightly, almost amused. "Really? You still believe there's someone upstairs pulling strings for you? Even after everything?" A few people in the audience laughed. The question hung in the air. Hogan didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his hands resting on his knees. "I don't think God pulls strings. I think he walks with you when the strings fall apart." The room quieted just slightly. The host blinked. "Deep," she said after a beat. "But come on, Hulk. You really believe that? You think someone's watching over you? That there's meaning in all of this? That the pain, the loss, the betrayal, it's all part of some big divine plan?" He glanced down briefly, his hand brushing the cross around his neck. He didn't make a show of it, didn't grip it dramatically, just acknowledged it. "I don't always understand it," he said. "I just know I've made it through things I shouldn't have, and I didn't do it alone." There was no music cue, no laughter track. The moment hovered awkwardly, like the air had changed just slightly. The host laughed, but the sound didn't carry. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to be so calm. Thought I could get a little fire out of you. You're not the first to try. More laughter, but it was thinner now. The energy had shifted. The host adjusted her tone. So tell me, seriously, do you pray? I do. Every day? Most days. And what do you pray for? More strength? Forgiveness? Another WrestleMania? He smiled. Peace, mostly, for myself, for people I've hurt, for people who've hurt me. She hesitated. That hadn't been the answer she expected. Peace, she repeated. That's a new one. He nodded. It's underrated. The host looked at him for a moment, her expression neutral. So you're saying after all the fame, the money, the ups and downs, the lawsuits, the tabloids, you're just here, talking about peace. I used to think being strong meant being loud. Now, I think it means being still. Something about the way he said it plain, without drama settled over the room. It was the kind of thing that didn't demand a reaction. It just asked to be heard. The host leaned forward again, this time slower. I've interviewed a lot of people on this stage. Athletes, actors, politicians. Most of them are trying to prove something. Some of them want redemption. Some want revenge. What do you want, Hogan? He thought for a moment, then shrugged lightly. Just to leave a little more light behind me than I took with me. No laughter this time, no applause, just quiet. The host let the silence breathe, then gave a soft chuckleone that didn't have teeth behind it. Well, she said, that might be the most unwrestler answer I've ever heard. Maybe, he replied, but I haven't been in a ring in a long time. The audience smiled. The energy had changed. Something slower, quieter. The host shifted again. Her voice lowered a little. Look, I know people have made jokes about you, about your past, about the stuff you've said, done, believed in. But here you are, still showing up. Yeah? He said. Still showing up? Why? He didn't miss a beat. Because that's what faith is. It's not fireworks. It's not always feeling good. Sometimes it's just getting up and not giving up. The words weren't polished. They weren't poetic. But they landed. He wasn't trying to be profound. He was just telling the truth. The host looked down at her cards, then back at him. She was quiet for a long second. Fair enough. Then she sat back in her chair. Let's take a break. The music came in, but softer than before. The audience clapped, but not quite as loud. And as the light shifted for commercial, the camera caught Hulk Hogan sitting still, the cross gently resting against his chest, eyes calm, unbothered. He wasn't there to win. He was there to remain. And something about that was louder than anything else in the room. During the break, the studio crew moved quickly but quietly. Microphones were adjusted. Makeup artists hovered but weren't called. The usual buzzing backstage chatter was more subdued tonight. Something had shifted in the air, and everyone felt it, even if no one could name it. The host stood briefly by the edge of the stage, flipping through her cards with less certainty than before. Normally, she'd spend the commercial break finding a sharper edge, planning the next angle. But now, she wasn't sure where to go. When they came back from break, the lights warmed and the audience gave the required applause. But it felt like a formality this time, not a celebration. The host settled back into her chair, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at Hogan with an expression that was half thoughtful, half guarded. All right, she said, her tone lighter than before. Let's talk about legacy. He raised his eyebrows just slightly, waiting. You've been a lot of things, she continued. The face of wrestling, a reality TV personality, an actor, a brand, and for some people a cautionary tale. When you look back, what do you think you'll be remembered for? Hogan didn't answer right away. He rubbed one thumb slowly over his knuckle, thinking, "I used to want to be remembered for the big things," he said finally. "The crowds, the belts, the records. You know, all the stuff that comes with being the guy." She nodded. "But that stuff doesn't last," he continued. "Now I just want to be remembered by the people who knew me when no one else was watching." "Anyone in particular?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, my kids. A couple close friends. Some folks I've let down and tried to make it right with." The host tilted her head. "Do you think you've succeeded?" "No," he said without flinching. "Not always, but I'm trying." That kind of honest-blunt, unvarnished landed more heavily than any rehearsed quote ever could. The audience stayed silent. Not uncomfortable, but still. The host narrowed her eyes slightly. "You know," she said, "some people might say it's a little convenient. This faith thing, that it showed up after the fame faded, after the scandals, after the damage. She wasn't being cruel. She was being real, and she was waiting to see if he could handle it. But he didn't even blink. "I get that," he said. "And maybe they're right. Maybe I had to lose a lot before I was ready to see what mattered." "You saying you found God in rock bottom?" "I think he was there the whole time," Hogan said. "I just didn't stop long enough to notice." There was no dramatic pause. No soft music behind the words. Just a man telling the truth he had earned the hard way. The host tapped her pen against the edge of the card in her hand. "What made you stop?" He looked at her, then down at the table, then back up again. "My son's accident," he said. That changed everything. She softened, just slightly. "I've read about it," she said. "It was bad." "It was," he said. "And not just because of what happened to the other boy. Not just the legal stuff. It was watching my son suffer. Not just physically, but emotionally. Watching him blame himself. Watching us all get torn apart from the inside. My family didn't just break, it splintered." "And that made you believe in God?" "No," he said. "It made me feel alone, like nobody could fix it. And then one day I just said his name. Not to preach, not to get help, just because I didn't know who else to talk to." The room was quiet. "I didn't hear a voice," he said. "Didn't see a sign. But I didn't feel alone anymore. And I held on to that every day since." The host was silent. Something in her jaw tightened for a moment before she asked, "You talk to him a lot?" "Every morning," he said, "and most nights. I'm not perfect about it. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's just sitting there and breathing." The host shook her head, not mockingly. More like someone trying to understand a language they hadn't heard in years. "It's just hard to imagine," she said. "You, the Hulk Hogan, sitting quietly and praying." "I don't wear the boa when I do it," he said, smiling. The audience laughed. A real laugh. It broke the tension without breaking the truth. "Okay," she said. "Fair enough." He leaned forward a little. "You know," he said, "people think faith is all about answers, but it's more about staying upright when you've got none." The host looked down, her fingers curling around the edge of her note cards. There was something shifting in her, but she wasn't ready to name it. She looked up again. "Have you ever doubted it?" "Every day," he said. "That's how I know it's real." She studied him, then leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "You know what I was told before tonight," she said. "That you'd be easy. That I could poke a little, get you to rant about politics or complain about how the world's changed. Maybe get a few viral clips out of it. Is that what you were trying to do?" She didn't answer right away. Then, with a shrug, she said, "It's part of the job." He nodded. "Fair. But You didn't bite, she added. Not even once. He smiled again, gently. I don't wrestle for crowds anymore. The audience chuckled again, but quieter this time. Why not? She asked. I'm not here to perform, he said. I'm here to be. She looked at him, eyes narrowed slightly. You really mean that? Yeah, he said. I do. Another beat passed. Then she said, We're going to go to break again. The music came in. But the applause was slow, uncertain not because people were uncomfortable, but because they were thinking. And as the lights dimmed slightly, the camera once again caught the image that would soon flood the internet. Hogan, silent, hands folded, the cross around his neck just barely visible beneath his shirt. No posing, no speech, just a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to carry. The second break passed like the first low voices, careful adjustments, crew members avoiding eye contact they usually didn't think twice about. Something about the silence Hogan carried had spilled into the space around him, not awkward but reverent. Even the assistant producers, usually glued to their headsets, had started whispering. When the lights came up again, the host seemed more composed, but not entirely in control. She cleared her throat and sat upright, but the energy in her movements was more reserved. She wasn't leaning forward like before. She looked like someone not sure what they wanted to say, but knowing they had to say something. So, she began, voice steady but quieter now, you've been through a lot. We touched on some of it. But the truth is, the world hasn't always been kind to you. And I imagine you haven't always been kind to it either. Hogan didn't deny it. That's true. You had everything once. Fame, power, money. And then what? The lawsuits? The tapes? The headlines? You were practically a joke at one point. He nodded once. That part's true too. And you think faith brought you back from that? No, he said. I think falling apart brought me to faith. The host tilted her head, curious now not just for the camera, but because something inside her wanted to know what he meant. There was a point, Hogan continued, when I couldn't walk into a grocery store without hearing whispers. I'd lost my family, my reputation, my body was broken. I'd wake up hurting in places I didn't even know I had bones. There was a time I didn't think I was going to make it. The words weren't dramatic. He wasn't embellishing. I was sitting in a dark room one night, he said. Just done. Couldn't wrestle. Couldn't fix anything. Couldn't take back what I'd said. Couldn't control what people thought. And I just said out loud, if you're there, I can't do this anymore. The host was still. So was the room. No bolt of lightning, Hogan added. No miracle. But the next morning, I got out of bed. Didn't feel better. Just not alone. He let the words hang there. That was enough to start with. The host swallowed. She looked at her notes, but didn't reach for them. That doesn't sound like a revival, she said. It wasn't, he replied. It was surrender. She nodded slowly. That's not a word most people would associate with you. They used to chant my name in stadiums, he said. Now I'm happy if someone remembers I treated them with respect. The audience didn't clap. No one made a sound. But the mood in the room had shifted again, softer, fuller, as if everyone there was beginning to realize that maybe this man's strength hadn't been in his muscles or in his legend but in what he'd survived. The host leaned forward again, her voice more tentative now. Can I ask you something personal? Sure. Do you ever feel like you don't deserve the grace you're talking about? He looked at her, not guarded, not defensive, just honest. Every day. And yet you still pray, especially on the days I feel like I don't deserve to. She nodded, biting her bottom lip for a second. That's strange. Feels that way sometimes. I don't think I've ever said a prayer that wasn't desperate. Hogan looked at her gently. That's still a prayer. The audience didn't move. Somewhere near the front, someone blinked fast, like they didn't want tears to fall. The host turned her gaze down for a long moment. She shifted her cards aside, no longer pretending to need them. You said earlier that your son's accident changed you. He nodded. Was that the worst moment? He hesitated. One of them. What was the worst? He sat quietly. The studio lights were warm on his shoulders. The air was still. The night I thought I had no one left who wanted me alive, he said. A few people inhaled sharply. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. I didn't plan to do anything, he said. But I didn't care if I didn't wake up. And what stopped you? He looked down at the cross. This. That necklace? No, he said. What it reminded me of, that someone suffered and stayed kind, that someone forgave people who didn't ask for it, that maybe I could learn to do the same. The host looked at him like she wanted to argue but couldn't. She leaned back again. What do you say to people who don't believe any of it? He shrugged. I'm not here to convince anyone. Then why are you here? He smiled slightly. To stay still. That's it? Somebody out there needs to see that you can fall apart and still sit here without rage, without blame, just being. The host opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked out toward the audience. They were silent. Then she turned back to him. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. You're not angry? No. Not even at me? No. Why not? Hogan thought for a moment. Because people say what they're ready to say. You were doing your job. I'm just trying to live mine a little better than I used to. She stared at him. Not offended. Not impressed. Just moved. Do you think, she said slowly, that grace can reach someone who hasn't earned it? I think grace only goes where it's needed. That landed. Deep. Somewhere in the third row, a man wiped his cheek with the side of his hand. The host sat very still, and for the first time in the night, her voice lowered so much that the mics almost didn't catch it. Then maybe it's got a long way to go with me. Hogan looked at her not as an opponent, not even as a host, just a person. It's already closer than you think, he said. The studio didn't cut to commercial right away. There was no cue, no applause sign. The control room let it hang. The audience didn't need to be told what to do. They were still. Because somehow, in the middle of a taped segment meant for entertainment, something had happened. Not explosive, not viral, just human. And the silence that followed, it didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. She didn't say anything during the next break. No whispered cues, no half-jokes to producers, no scanning of the audience for reassurance. She just sat there, elbows resting on the arms of her chair, hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The laughter had stopped earlier in the evening, but now even the buzz of irony that usually hung in the studio air had vanished. It was like the set itself had taken a deep breath and didn't know how to exhale. The camera crew, usually loose and joking between takes, stood in a kind of focused reverence. Some adjusted lights that didn't need adjusting. Some looked down at their phones, but no one was scrolling. They were just waiting. Hogan sat with the same ease as before, hands folded loosely in his lap, legs planted firmly like he wasn't going anywhere. The cross still hung gently against his chest. His fingers tapped against his thinot nervously, just rhythmically. A man not rehearsing something to say, but content in saying nothing. When the lights came back on, the host seemed different. Her expression wasn't guarded anymore. It was tired, not physically but emotionally. Like someone who'd been running on the fuel of sarcasm for years and had just realized the tank was empty. I want to ask you something I've never asked on this show, she said, her voice quiet and steady. Hogan didn't move. He just waited. Have you ever felt like you were being punished? He blinked once. Yes. For what? For being proud. For chasing all the wrong things. For hurting people I didn't mean to. For forgetting who I was when no one was watching. She nodded slowly. I used to pray as a kid, she said, eyes lowered. I didn't grow up in a religious home, but I used to pray anyway. Sometimes in my closet, sometimes under the sheets. I used to whisper, "Please, let me be normal." I didn't even know what I meant by that. Just something other than what I was. Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, but she kept going. I'd beg, don't let me go to hell. Don't let them find out who I really am. And then I'd go to school and laugh louder than anyone, make fun of everything, especially religion. She looked up now, directly at him. Maybe I wasn't laughing at God. Maybe I was just trying to laugh at the fear. Hogan didn't speak. He didn't nod. He didn't react. He just listened. And somehow, that made it easier for her to keep going. I became really good at being clever, she said. People don't notice when you're hurting if you're clever. You can hide anything behind a smirk, even the parts of you that never healed. She blinked several times, her composure thinning. And the truth is, when you came on tonight, I thought I could do the same thing I always do. Ask the tough questions, get the edge, make the audience laugh. She let out a breath. But you didn't play along. I wasn't here to play, Hogan said softly. I know, she said, and that's what scared me. The silence in the studio now wasn't heavy. It was expectant. Like the room had turned into something more than cameras and chairs. I haven't prayed in years, she admitted. Not once. Not even during the bad times. I told myself it was all nonsense. That it didn't matter. That no one was listening. She looked at him, eyes searching. Was I wrong? He held her gaze with a kindness that was almost unbearable in its quiet. No one who cries in the dark is ever unheard, he said. Not by the one who matters. Her eyes welled, but she didn't look away. What if I don't know how to believe again? You don't start with belief, he said. You start with honesty. And then what? Then you let grace do the rest. There was no music. No cue for applause. Just two people, no longer host and guest, sitting in a moment neither had planned for. Somewhere in the audience, a woman clutched her hands together and whispered something. No one heard it, but she mouthed the word thank you. Backstage, one of the camera operators, usually stone-faced and unimpressed by celebrity wiped under his eye with the back of his sleeve. The producers in the control booth didn't cut away, didn't zoom in, didn't pan to the crowd. They just watched. Because something about this wasn't entertainment. It was truth. And truth doesn't need angles. The host took a shaky breath and turned toward the camera for the first time that night. Her voice didn't tremble, but it softened. If you're watching this, she said, and you've ever felt like faith was a joke or that silence meant no one was listening, I want you to know I used to feel that too. She looked at Hogan, then back at the camera. But tonight something happened. I don't know what to call it. I don't have a label for it. But it felt real, and I think maybe that's what matters. She reached for his hand across the table. He didn't flinch. He just offered it. Their hands met not as a gesture for the cameras, but for each other. I'm not here to preach, she said, and neither is he. She looked at him again. But I think Grace walked into this room tonight. And then, without warning, the lights above them flickered. Just once. The sound in the studio crackled for a second, and then silence. 10 full seconds. No mics. No lights. No movement. Just the two of them sitting in that sudden, unexplained darkness. The studio didn't panic. No one gasped. No one moved. Because whatever had just happened didn't feel accidental. It felt like a pause, a breath. The moment felt sacred not in a religious sense but in a human one. When the lights returned and the cameras resumed, no one said anything right away. The host sat still. Hogan's eyes were closed, his lips gently parted, like he'd been in prayer. And the audience, blinking, reverent, changed, just stared. No one knew what the glitch had been. Power surge, audio cut, a blip in the system. But it didn't matter. Because, in that moment, something had arrived. And not one person in that room wanted to interrupt it. The segment was supposed to air the following Thursday. That was the plan. The network had its release schedule, the editors had their notes, the producers had their sound bites ready. But that's not what happened. The clip leaked. Not the whole interview, not a polished promo. Just one stretch of footage, unedited, raw, with no background music and no voiceover. It wasn't even the host's moment of honesty that caught fire. It wasn't Hogan's calm responses, or his talk of prayer or pain or grace. It was the silence. Exactly 10 seconds. From the moment the lights dimmed and the microphones went dead, the cameras kept rolling on accident, or maybe by design. The shot caught the two of them, sitting motionless, Hogan with his eyes closed. The host, staring straight ahead like someone suspended in thought. The audience, perfectly still, not confused, not restless, just there. The clip was 30 seconds long, but it was the 10 in the middle that changed everything. No one spoke. No one moved. And the internet couldn't stop watching it. At first, it made the rounds quietly. A few fan accounts posted it, asking if it had been a technical error. Some speculated it was a mistake. Others thought it had been staged. But then, someone added a caption, "This is what stillness looks like." And it exploded. People didn't share it with hot takes or laughing emojis. They shared it with one-word captions. Needed this. Watched 5 times. Something about this felt like prayer. Within 24 hours, the clip had been reposted over 2 million times. By day 3, it was being discussed on podcasts, stitched into TikToks, set to quiet ambient music, and even analyzed by behavioral psychologists who called it a collective emotional exhale. News anchors tried to explain it. Was it God? A glitch? Just good editing? But no one cared about the cause anymore. They cared about the feeling. Because for 10 seconds, the world had paused. And it had felt right. People who had never prayed found themselves watching it before bed. A man in Chicago shared it with the caption, "Haven't spoken to my brother in 10 years. Just sent him this. That's all I had to say." A woman in South Africa played it on loop during her meditation class and said, "That moment has more peace than anything I've tried to put into words." A teenager wrote in the comments, "This is what I wanted my church to feel like." And suddenly, it wasn't just a moment from a talk show. It was a mirror. And it showed people something they had forgotten they needed. Stillness. The host said nothing online. No comments, no interviews, no reactions. The network panicked behind the scenestream to find a narrative, trying to get ahead of a story that wasn't scandalous or dramatic, but was somehow more uncontrollable than any of that. They didn't know what to do with grace, especially not when it was trending. 10 seconds became a movement, but not like the others. No slogans, no debates, just space. People began posting their own 10 seconds, videos of nothing, just a candle flickering, or an empty room, or a close-up of someone's hand resting on another's. Churches started playing the clip in their services, not as a sermon, but as a breath. Prisons began using it to open reflection sessions. A teacher in Oklahoma played it for her class, and no one laughed. A counselor in Seoul used it to help patients reconnect with the part of themselves they were scared to feel. And always, always, the same caption. Just watch. Don't explain it. Just feel it. And people did. Even those who didn't believe in anything felt something. Because the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything we push down, everything we avoid. It was grief, reverence, regret, peace. It was the voice we never hear because we never stop long enough to listen. And Hogan? He never commented. He didn't post about it, didn't retweet anything, didn't go on tour or appear on morning shows to talk about the moment. He just stayed the same. Silent. Present. A man who had already lived through louder things than fame. When asked in an unrelated interview how he felt about the viral clip, he smiled and said, "I'm just glad it helped people breathe." That was it. And still, the story kept growing. A woman in a nursing home in Vermont played the clip for her daughter and said, "That's what your father used to feel like when he held my hand." A little boy in Sao Paulo watched it and asked his mom, "Is this what heaven is?" A priest in Dublin paused his sermon mid-sentence and played the clip from his phone. Then he said, "Let that be the message today." In churches, in schools, in subways, on phones in airports, and in kitchens at midnight and on lonely park benches, people watched the silence. And when they did, they cried. Or they didn't. They prayed. Or they didn't. They just felt. Because somehow, one man's stillness had reached across the noise of a whole world and reminded us all, you don't need to speak to be heard. You don't need to prove to be known. You don't need to win to be remembered. You just need to stay. And Hulk Hogan stayed. Even when the lights went out. The show didn't air another episode that week, or the week after. The network kept issuing vague updates, calling it a creative pause, a format re-evaluation. But inside the building, everyone knew something had shifted, and it wasn't the ratings, it was her. The host stayed away from the press. Her team begged her to get ahead of the narrative book, another big name, address the moment, pivot. She said no to all of it. Not angrily, just quietly. And then she stopped showing up to meetings altogether. She wasn't hiding. She was trying to listen. It started with the letters. At first, just a few envelopes showed up at the studio. Then a box, then another. Then it became crates, delivered daily. Thousands of handwritten letters, typed emails, folded cards with shaky handwriting and coffee stains. Some from cities she couldn't pronounce, others from streets she'd driven past without noticing. They weren't hate mail. They were confessions. A woman in Arizona wrote, "I used to pray with my husband before dinner. When he died, I stopped. I watched your interview with Hulk Hogan and cried for the first time in years. I sat in silence, and I think I felt him there." A man in London. "I haven't spoken to God since my daughter passed. I thought silence meant abandonment. But when I watched that moment, I realized maybe I just wasn't ready to hear anything until now." A boy from Detroit, 17 years old, shaky handwriting. "I don't go to church. I don't really believe in God. But when everything went quiet on your show, I felt something. I think it was peace. I didn't know peace could feel like that." She read each one slowly, not in a rush. She kept them stacked in boxes at home, tucked into drawers, and spread out on her kitchen table. Some she reread in the middle of the night, when the world felt too loud again. She didn't understand what was happening inside her, but she knew something had started. At first, it felt like guilt, but then she realized it wasn't guilt at all. It was grief, not over anything she had done, but over everything she had let die inside her. She remembered what Hogan had said. You don't start with belief, you start with honesty. So she started writing, not tweets, not scripts, just pieces of herself, scrawled onto notepads, backs of envelopes, anything within reach. I don't know if you're there, but I miss the version of me who thought you were. I keep watching that moment, the silence, and I feel something I haven't felt since I was a child. Hope without proof. If you're listening, I don't need a sign. Just stay. She didn't call them prayers. She didn't kneel. She didn't light candles or fold her hands. She just wrote. And slowly, her sarcasm began to fall away. Not because it had stopped being sharp, but because it had stopped being necessary. The armor she'd carried so long had started to crack, and in those cracks she wasn't finding shame. She was finding light. Everywhere she went now, people stopped her. Not to criticize, not even to praise. They just said, "Thank you," and always, "I saw myself in you." One woman in a bookstore held her hand and whispered, "You said the thing I've been too afraid to admit, that I don't know how to believe anymore." A man in an airport said, "I was a pastor for 30 years. I lost everything. But when you said you didn't know what to call it, I felt seen." She had never wanted to lead anything. She had wanted control. But now, without trying, she had become a reflection of doubt, of memory, of the fragile space between belief and disbelief. And Hogan? He never reached out, never called, never sent a message. And somehow, that made it more real. She started watching clips of him from years past. Not the wrestling highlights, the quiet interviews, the ones where he talked about recovery, about forgiveness, about rebuilding something with nothing but his bare hands and broken faith. One night, alone on her balcony with a cup of tea, she whispered aloud, "I think I get it now." No one answered, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like someone had been listening the whole time. She picked up one of the letters from the kitchen table. It was from a teenage girl in rural Montana. "I thought I had to believe everything or nothing, but you made me think maybe belief is just staying open, even when it hurts." The host set the letter down, stared out at the city lights below, and for the first time in years she prayed. Not with words, not with certainty, just with breath, just with being still, because maybe that's where it always begins again. She hadn't planned on coming back, not for a finale, not for a statement, not for closure. She had told the network she was done politely, but firmly. For the first time in years, she wasn't interested in steering the conversation. She didn't want to own the moment. She wanted to understand it. But the letters kept coming. And slowly, the silence began to grow not just inside her, but around her. It stopped feeling like the absence of something and started to feel like the presence of something else. Peace. One morning, she woke up before sunrise, made a cup of coffee, and stood barefoot by the window as the first light cut through the city haze. Her apartment was still. No TV, no music. Just her, and the faint hum of traffic far below. She thought of the studio, of the crowd, of the silence that stretched across millions of screens. She thought of Hogan, sitting still, not trying to convince, just being. She thought of her own words, the ones she didn't plan to say, but had said anyway. And then she made the call. Just one sentence. "I want one more episode." The network hesitated. Not because of logistics, but because they didn't know what she had in mind. No sponsors were booked, no guest had been scheduled, there was no agenda. but something in her voice was steady in a way they hadn't heard before, and they agreed. The announcement came quietly. No teasers, no dramatic promo. Just a simple message posted on the show's official page. One more. That was all it took. The audience sold out in hours. But the crowd that arrived wasn't buzzing with the usual energy. There were no signs, no cheering, no flash. Just people, older than usual, softer. Like they knew they weren't coming for a performance. The lights came up slowly. The theme music didn't play. And then she walked onto the stage. No designer suit, no heels, just dark jeans, a black sweater, and a microphone clipped to her collar. Her hair was tied back. No makeup crew had touched her face, and her eyes, they were clear. She stood in the center of the stage, alone. No guest chair beside her, no desk. Just a stool placed slightly to her left, untouched. And then, without notes, she began. I've been asked why I disappeared after the last episode. The audience listened, no clapping. No applause signs. I've been asked why I didn't clarify what happened, why I didn't correct the narrative, why I didn't ride the wave. She smiled. But it wasn't for show. The truth is, I didn't know what to say. She paused. That night, something happened that wasn't planned. Not by me, not by my producers. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't coordinated, and I know that sounds dramatic, but it wasn't. It was the opposite. She looked around the room. Everyone was leaning forward. It was still. She took a breath, grounding herself in the silence again. I spent most of my career building a voice, sharpening it, using it to cut through noise, to challenge people, to protect myself. I believed, and I still believe, that asking hard questions matters. Another pause. But I didn't realize how much I'd used that voice to drown out my own silence, to avoid my own questions. She turned slightly, looking toward the empty guest chair. When Hulk Hogan came on this stage, I expected him to play along. I expected someone I could bounce off of, push around, maybe even provoke, and instead, he gave me something I didn't know I needed. Her voice caught slightly, but she didn't pull back. He gave me stillness. He gave me space. A few people in the front row wiped their eyes. And in that silence, those 10 seconds when everything cut out, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid, whispering prayers under my breath that I didn't think anyone was listening to. She looked down at her hands. I felt heard. She let the words settle. Not sell, not convince, just settle. I'm not here tonight to preach. I'm not here to apologize. I'm not here to relaunch anything. I'm here because you've written me letters, thousands of them. And whether you call it God, or grace, or a glitch in the system, something happened, and I don't think it was meant to be explained. She walked slowly to the guest chair, rested her hand on the back of it. This chair was supposed to be filled tonight, but it's not. She looked back at the crowd, because the person who filled it already said everything they needed to say, and I think the rest is mine to figure out. She walked back to center stage. Her voice dropped slightly. I used to think faith meant certainty. Now I think maybe it just means showing up when you're not. She let that sit. No music, no applause. I'm going to step away after tonight. Not in shame, not in fear, just in truth. A soft inhale echoed across the room. I've spent most of my life trying to run the show, but tonight I'd like to end it with a moment of silence. No one moved. No one resisted. She closed her eyes. 10 seconds. Not rehearsed. Not calculated. Just silence. And when she opened them again, her face looked lighter. Not relieved. Not proud. Just real. She smiled, softly. Thank you. and the screen faded to black. It wasn't the kind of episode that trends. There were no viral rants, no unexpected guests, no social media drama to dissect. The lighting was flat. The stage was bare. And the woman at the center of it all didn't say anything that could be clipped into a meme. But the next morning it was everywhere. Not in headlines screaming for clicks. Not in tabloids or celebrity reels. Just in people's hearts. The 10 seconds of silence she requested, mirroring the very one that had unintentionally sparked it, all spread again, quietly, like a message sent without a sender. No special effects, no score. Just a woman standing alone on a stage, eyes closed, holding space. And the world joined her. Teachers played it in classrooms. Hospice workers shared it with grieving families. A video of inmates in a correctional facility watching the clip went viral not because they reacted dramatically, but because they didn't. They just sat, heads bowed. Some in thought. Others in something closer to prayer. The comments weren't loud. They were honest. I haven't cried in years, but I did today. She didn't teach me anything. She reminded me of what I forgot. I didn't even realize I missed silence. People began taking 10 seconds again. Before dinner. After arguments. In the middle of crowded subway rides. Before sending angry emails. Before saying something they couldn't take back. It became a pausier, small rebellion against the speed of everything. And through it all, Hogan remained completely silent. No press tour. No podcast appearances. No reflective interviews. He didn't tweet about it. He didn't repost clips. He didn't offer thoughts on the movement. He didn't need to, because he wasn't the center of it anymore. He was the start of it. And that was more than enough. Someone posted a clip of him from a past interview long before this all began. A clip where he said, "It's not about who you were when the lights were on, it's about who you stayed being when they turned off." That clip, too, began to spread. A boy in Minnesota wrote a blog post that went viral in its own quiet way. He'd been going through cancer treatment. 17 years old. Angry. Isolated. His post read, "When the machines were running and the nurses were talking, I could pretend I was okay. But when they left the room, and it was just me and the sound of the IV, I wanted to scream. Then I saw the clip. 10 seconds of nothing. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. So I closed my eyes. And I didn't ask for healing. I just said, I'm still here. And I was. There was no call to action. No merchandise. No organization claiming credit. Just people remembering something they didn't know they'd lost. Hogan himself continued living quietly. He went to the gym, ate breakfast at a small diner by the beach, signed autographs when asked, smiled, listened. And sometimes, when no one was looking, he walked down to the shoreline just after sunrise and stood barefoot in the sand, the cross hanging from his neck, eyes closed as the waves came and went. He never said what he was thinking. But those who saw him said the same thing. He looked peaceful. Not because he had everything together, but because he wasn't running from anything anymore. A camera crew spotted him one morning and tried to ask questions. He just shook his head politely. "No need, brother," he said. "Some things aren't meant to be retold." Instead, he gave the cameraman something elsey nod, a smile, and one line. "Keep walking the good road, even if it's quiet." The man later wrote that down and taped it to his dashboard. Not because it was profound, but because it was true. And that's how it went. The story didn't end with a dramatic arc or a press conference. It faded into life, into real, messy, quiet lives, where people hurt, and hope, and sit, and whisper prayers they don't know how to form, and still show up, even when they're unsure, especially then, because what Hogan showed wasn't that faith is loud, it was that it's patient. That grace doesn't shout to be heard. It just stays. And now, everywhere from church pews to city sidewalks to quiet kitchens at 2 a.m., people were learning that maybe they didn't need all the answers. Maybe it was enough to just take 10 seconds and stay. She never said goodbye on camera. No press statement. No farewell episode. No official announcement. Just one post-text only, black background. No hashtags. Thank you for letting me be real. I'll carry that with me. And that was it. The network respected her decision, probably more out of confusion than reverence. She had done the one thing no one expected from someone with her platform. She walked away when the light was on her. Not to escape. To return to something quieter. In the weeks that followed, her name slowly stopped trending. The headlines moved on. The chatter faded. But in quiet corners of the internet, people still talked about her final episode. About the way she didn't try to wrap it in a bow. About the silence. About how that stillness had somehow said more than anything she'd ever spoken. And somewhere in Florida, in a modest, sun-washed house not far from the coast, Hogan sat on his porch one morning, sipping black coffee from a cup that said, "Brother," in faded, bold letters. The air was humid. A bird chirped from a fence post. A lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask for anything. Then the mail arrived. He didn't get much anymore. A few magazines, the occasional fan letter, but this one was different. No return address. Simple white envelope. He turned it over in his hand twice before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note. No name. Just the same handwriting he remembered from the note card she'd held during the interview, the one she never looked at again once they started talking. I thought silence meant no one was listening. I was wrong. Thank you for not meeting my cynicism with anger. Thank you for staying when you didn't have to. I still don't know what I believe, but I do know this. Grace didn't leave. I just stopped looking for it. There was no signature. Just one final line. You reminded me that even someone like me can be forgiven. He read it twice, then a third time, then folded it gently and slid it back into the envelope, tucking it into the pocket of his worn denim vest. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He just sat there, the cup in his hand cooling slowly. After a few minutes, he set the cup down, stood up, and walked out to the sand path that led to the shore. The tide was low, and the beach was empty. He stood facing the water, breathing in deeply. No cameras, no audience, just the ocean, the sky, and a man who had carried the weight of many things and had learned slowly how to lay them down. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the letter again, and stared at it for a long moment. Then he folded it one more time, pressed it gently to his chest, and whispered a single word. Grace. Not loudly. Not for anyone to hear. Just for himself. He placed the letter in a small metal box buried near the dunes, next to a wooden cross he had carved years ago and kept there like a secret. And then he stood again. Still, whole, at peace. Because sometimes what we leave behind isn't measured in numbers or fame or applause. It's measured in the way someone forgives themselves in silence. And for the first time, perhaps in his entire life, Hulk Hogan wasn't trying to live up to the legend. He was just living in the light. They never built a foundation, never launched a campaign. No church adopted the moment as doctrine. No organization tried to trademark it. And still, it spread. Not as a movement, as a memory. Years from now, people wouldn't remember the host's name or what channel the show aired on. They wouldn't recall the exact date or even the technical glitch that sparked it all, but they'd remember the feeling. They'd remember the silence, the 10 seconds that somehow felt like someone had placed their hand gently over the noise and said, "It's okay, just rest." And they'd remember him. Not as a celebrity. Not as the voice behind, "What you gonna do, brother?" but as the man who sat still, who didn't defend his faith with fire, but with peace, and who reminded the world that maybe you don't need to shout to be strong. In a small town in Kansas, a middle school teacher began opening her class with 10 seconds of silence each morning. She didn't explain it. She just said, "You don't have to fill the space." The students didn't laugh. They didn't roll their eyes. They leaned into it. Over time, some of them started closing their eyes. Others folded their hands on the desk. And one kid, who hadn't spoken more than a few words all year, started whispering a few to himself during that silence. No one asked what he said, and he didn't offer. But something softened in him after that. In Tokyo, a barista who had always played upbeat music in her cafe started turning the speakers off for 10 minutes each morning before opening. Customers noticed. Some left reviews online. There's something calming about the way the day starts here. Feels like I can breathe again. Not sure what it is, but I want more of it. In New Zealand, a father who had lost his wife the year before played the 10-second clip on the anniversary of her passing. He sat with his daughter, both of them holding a candle, both of them just there. Not sobbing, not forcing anything, just holding space for the grief, for the love, for the healing. And on a quiet beach in Florida, Hogan continued his walks. People saw him, sometimes. Always alone. Sometimes with a small bag slung over his shoulder, filled with letters fans had left in his mailbox, or passed to him silently in diners. He never posted them. Never made a show of reading them. But he did. Every one. And every now and then he'd write back, not always in words. Sometimes in small gestures. A signed cross left in a hospital waiting room. A hand on someone's shoulder with a quiet, "You're not done yet." A note slipped under someone's door at a recovery center. Stillness doesn't mean you stopped. It means you're letting God catch up to you. These things never went viral. They weren't meant to. They were meant to be carried, one by one. And they were. A retired truck driver in Texas kept Hogan's quote taped to his steering wheel. "Just show up. That's faith, brother." A teenager in France printed a still image from the show Hogan, eyes closed, hands folded, and pinned it above his desk. Not because he was religious. Because it reminded him that peace didn't always have to be loud. And a woman, the same one who once hosted a show filled with laughter and control, now walked dogs at a shelter part-time and spent her mornings journaling. She still didn't call it prayer. But she still showed up. And in one of those journals, tucked away between pages of poetry, lists, and fragments of letters she never sent, was a small, simple line. "He didn't win me over. He reminded me who I used to be." The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and unmarked. No return address, no studio branding, just his name, handwritten in blue ink. Terry. Not Hogan. Not Hulk. Just Terry. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, slipped into his mailbox between an ad for patio furniture and a utility bill. He didn't open it right away. He held it for a moment, feeling the paper's weight. There was no urgency in it, but there was something else, familiarity. When he did open it, the message inside was brief. "We're doing one last taping. No guests. No audience. Just space. If you're willing to be there not to say anything, just to sit, We'd be honored. No expectations. You're not required to speak. But you were the beginning, and it feels right to end with you. There was no signature. He knew who it was from. He set the letter on his kitchen counter, made a pot of coffee, and stood at the window as the sun burned low over the trees. Then he picked up the letter again, folded it gently, and placed it inside his Bible. 3 days later, he boarded a quiet flight to the city. No press knew. No handlers. No entourage. Just him and a small duffel bag. When he arrived at the studio, the staff was minimal. No crowd, no lights in the lobby, no audience waiting in the wings. A producer he didn't recognize greeted him with a soft smile and a clipboard he didn't use. "Right this way," the man said, motioning gently. The stage looked different now. There was no desk, no high-backed chairs, just a circle of warm light in the middle of the floor. 2 chairs sat across from each other. One was empty. The other was already occupied. She looked up when he entered, and they exchanged a nod. Nothing else? No words? No small talk? She looked different now. Not older, just lighter. Like something she'd carried for years had finally been placed down somewhere she trusted. He walked toward her, not with hesitation, not with performance, just presence. He took the seat across from her and rested his hands on his knees. There were no cameras. Not this time. Just a soft overhead glow and the sound of 2 people breathing. She looked at him not as a host, not as a figurehead, but as a man who had taught her something in 10 seconds that she'd never learned in decades of interviews. "I didn't invite you to talk," she said gently. He nodded. "I figured. I just wanted to be still again, with someone who understands what that means." He leaned back slightly in his chair, the cross around his neck catching the soft light. "You found your way," he said quietly. She smiled. "No, I think I just stopped running." They sat together in silence for a while. A long while. No countdowns, no music cues. Just 2 people, once strangers, now sharing a moment the world would never see but would still somehow feel. After some time, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "I wrote this after that night," she said, "but I never sent it. I wasn't ready." She held it out to him. He took it carefully, as if it might break. "I don't need a response," she added. "I just needed to know you'd seen it." He nodded again, slower this time. Then he tucked the note into his coat pocket without opening it. "I'll read it when it's time." She smiled, and again they were quiet. Eventually, they stood. She extended her hand not for a shake, but just to meet his. He took it, held it for a second longer than necessary. And when he let go, she didn't say goodbye. Because some goodbyes aren't endings. They're acknowledgements of what was, of what changed, of what still lives in the quiet. As he walked back through the hallway and into the cool evening air, Hogan didn't look back. He didn't need to, because something in him had already closed. Not in loss, but in peace. And some chapters don't end with applause. They end with someone choosing stillness again. No one ever saw the footage. There was nothing to leak. No audio file. No clip. The cameras in the studio hadn't been running, and no backup mic had been placed under the chairs. There wasn't even a still image to circulate. But people felt it. Not because they knew what happened, but because of what didn't. In the days following that quiet meeting, something began to stir. Again, not like a storm, not like a fire, but like a breeze. Gentle, unmissable, if you were still enough to notice. The host didn't return to the screen. Not in guest appearances, not in voiceovers or special reports. But she began writing. She published a piece note, a memoir, not an op-ed. Just a short article in a quiet magazine few people subscribed to, titled The Space Between Words. It spoke about silencenor as avoidance, but as invitation. It didn't mention Hogan by name, didn't mention herself even, just reflections. Lines like, "Sometimes we spend so long talking over pain that we forget what it sounds like to let it breathe. Grace doesn't interrupt. It waits until we're ready to stop shouting. I used to believe silence meant absence, but now I know it can be a kind of presence." The article didn't go viral, but it didn't have to, because people printed it out, taped it above desks, folded it into journals, read it aloud in recovery groups and Sunday morning circles and hospice rooms where no one had the energy to speak, but everyone wanted to feel something. And across the country, in places where no camera had ever been, people started doing something strange. They began pausing. Just pausing. Before yelling back. Before hitting send. Before walking away from someone who hadn't spoken the way they'd hoped. It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about certainty. It was about patience. Presence. People stopped assuming silence meant someone didn't care. They started realizing silence might be someone trying not to break. A youth pastor in Milwaukee began opening his weekly messages not with announcements, but with a chair, empty, lit by a single lamp. He'd say, "This is for anyone who never had a space to just sit." And the kids, some jaded, some hurting, some silent, started showing up early just to be in that room. He never told them what the chair meant. They knew. A hospice nurse in Quebec printed out a still image of Hogan, eyes closed from that first viral clip. She laminated it and placed it by the bedside of anyone nearing the end, right next to a note that read, "Take all the time you need. No one's rushing you now." Even people who had never watched the show felt the ripple. A mother in her kitchen, a cab driver pulling to the side of the road, a man kneeling beside a gravestone in the rain with nothing left to say, and finally realizing he didn't need to. He just needed to be there. And in Florida, Hogan continued to walk the shoreline. He didn't look for signs. He didn't need to feel useful. He had learned finally what strength really was. It wasn't in the crowds, or the camera, or the chance. It was in staying when the moment was quiet and offering no defense, just grace. That morning after the meeting, he returned home, brewed a pot of coffee, and opened the folded note she'd handed him. The words were simple. "I used to think stillness was surrender. Now, I think it's the beginning of everything." He smiled, folded it back up, and placed it inside the Bible next to her first letter. Then he picked up his phononaut to check notifications. Not to read news, but to dial one number. A friend. Someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered, surprised. "Hello?" There was a pause. Then Hogan said, "Hey, brother. Just wanted to say I'm still here." A breath. Then, "Me too." Years passed. The clip faded from circulation. The hashtags slowed. New faces rose on screens. New voices filled the noise. The internet turned its gaze elsewhere, as it always did. But the silence never left. It showed up in small places. In the way a father turned down the volume on the TV during dinner. In how a mother paused before answering her child's question, letting the quiet teach instead of correcting too fast. In how a teenager, overwhelmed and spiraling, sat cross-legged in the corner of his room and breathed, remembering a 10-second video that once made him cry without knowing why. The silence became a kind of language. It passed between strangers without translation. Like a woman who met a man in an airport waiting room and said nothing, but slid a folded napkin toward him with the words, "You're not too late." Or the baritone laughter of a man who held the hand of his dying friend and didn't say, "You'll be okay," just sat there, strong and still. The stillness began to grow roots in families that hadn't spoken in years. Not because they resolved everything, but because they finally made space for what couldn't be fixed. Hogan never gave a farewell tour. He wasn't seen in major headlines again. But every now and then, someone posted a photo blurry, unassuming of him at a diner or on a park bench or outside a small church, sometimes alone, sometimes deep in conversation with someone who didn't look like a fan, just someone who needed a moment. People said he looked different. Not older, more steady. One man described it in a comment beneath a photo. "It's like he carries peace the way he used to carry, energy like it fills the room, not in fire but in warmth." A reporter once asked someone close to him why he'd stopped giving interviews. The answer was simple. He said what he needed to say. The rest is just echo. In a small town on the edge of nowhere, a community centre put up a mural. Not flashy, just a painting of two chairs facing each other. Empty. A soft light between them. Below it, no name. Just a line. "When the noise fades, remember who stayed sitting with you." And years later, a little girl walked past it with her grandfather. She stopped, pointed at the mural, and asked, "What's that for?" He looked at it, smiled, and said, "That's where people learned to listen again." She didn't understand, but she remembered it. Because some stories don't need retelling to be remembered. They live in the quiet pauses between conversations, in the space where forgiveness first breathes, in the soft glance exchanged between two people who've both hurt and healed, in a letter never sent, in a breath that says more than any speech. And maybe that's the most anyone can hope for, not to be famous, or quoted, or trended, but to become part of someone's peace without ever needing to be known. The kind of presence you carry with you, long after the screen fades to black.